of GDP. One that's corrected for inflation and one that is not. Nominal GDP is not corrected for inflation. When you value the good that's being produced, you will value it in the current price. Depending, whatever year it is, you're just going to use that price. But nominal GDP really doesn't have that much meaning, and we'll see why when you see a mathematical example. What we really care about is what's called real GDP, which is corrected for inflation. And the way that we correct it for inflation is by always using the price of what we call a base year. We choose some base year and then make that price constant for all the preceding and all the earlier and later years. We just keep on using the same base year price for every single year. Yeah.
So what if like a classic car, like if it goes up in value and it's not sold, how would that affect?
Yeah, things like that are not captured very well. Like, I mean, so classic car, it only counted GDP once. It was worth like $5,000 in 1950. That's the only thing. Now you're right that it's more valuable now as a collector item. But in terms of GDP, since we didn't make anything new, it was just that $5,000 at 1950. And that should kind of make sense again, because who cares from the standpoint of how much stuff we're actually making? It doesn't matter that your 1950 Chevy is worth $1 million or $10 million. At the end of the day, we only built one Chevy car, so that's it. We count it and that's it. Yeah.
For the real GDP, how long do you use the price for the base year? Like the base
always.
Year, like 2013, you use 2013 for like
always forever. Yeah, not even just the 10 years in the future, but also the hundreds of years in the past. But you'll see better when I show you an actual mathematical example. It'll make more sense. Yeah.
So when comparing it to like the different countries' GDPs, and does everybody use the same one, or does America calculate theirs based on their base year? Or
No. If we want to compare between countries, we all have to use the same base year. Yeah. That way it's all comparable. But let me show you in words. This may not make that much sense. When you see the actual math, it actually makes a lot more sense. So for example, like let's say you have a very simple economy, right? All it makes is like pizzas and lattes, right? And P is the price of pizza. Q is how much pizza we're making. P is the price of lattes, and Q is how much lattes we're making. So nominal GDP is just like your typical way of thinking about GDP. It's the dollar value of all the stuff we're making in a year. Okay. So, and you just keep on using the prices in that year. So for example, like just by looking at it kind of simply, in 2009, what's the dollar value of pizzas that we made? 10 times 400, right? So that should be $4,000, right? So we made $4,000 worth of pizza. We made $2,000 worth of lattes. So what's the nominal GDP in 2009? Just 4,000 plus 2,000, it's $6,000, right? So to calculate nominal GDP, it's really easy. It's just like, what's the dollar value of the stuff that we're making every year? Which is like, exactly our definition of GDP. Like, what's the market value of all the final goods being produced in our country in a year? What are we gonna do for 2010? Same thing, right? The dollar value of pizzas is now gonna be 11 times 500, which is 5,500. 250 times 1,100. We add that up together, it's 8,250. 2011, same thing. 12 times 600, 3 times 1,200, and it's done. Okay. So nominal GDP is straightforward. It's just like, what is the dollar value of stuff that's being made in each year, valued at each of those years' prices. And we can then calculate, how much nominal GDP is growing. So in percentage terms, GDP has grown by like, 37.5% and 30.9%. Now, here is the issue with nominal GDP. What we really care about, and we'll learn this later, dollars are really nothing. Like dollars are just an arbitrary concept. It's an arbitrary sense of value that we created ourselves. And we can change that measurement whenever we want to. So dollars themselves really don't mean anything. What do we actually really care about? You don't care that pizza costs $10, really. What do you really care about? The fact that we actually have pizzas, right? Because that's what you eat. You don't eat the money. You eat the pizzas. You drink the lattes, right? So year after year, what do we care most about? The fact that we're making more pizza and more lattes. But the problem with nominal GDP is when nominal GDP increases from say 2010 to 2009, why is it increasing? Just by looking at the math here, just looking at the calculation. Why is nominal GDP increasing from year to year? Yeah, like one, the quantity is going up, but also pizzas are becoming more expensive because of inflation. They're like 10% more expensive. So now we've got a problem here. There's two things happening, but what do we really care about? You don't care that pizzas are 10% more, but for the overall economy, we just care about how many more pizzas we're getting, like how many more pizzas are we getting to eat, right? So that's where real GDP comes into play. How can we make it so that GDP reflects just only increases in quantity? What do we got to do? Yeah, make all the prices the same. So make it so all the prices are the same. And then if it changes, it has to reflect quantities, right? And so that's exactly what real GDP is. What we'll do is we'll choose a base year, right? And it can be any base year, but let's say we choose 2009 as the base year. So how's that gonna change all these calculations? If 2009 is the base year, everything here is the same except what? The price, right? So this 11 becomes 10. This 12 becomes, this 250 becomes 2, this 3 becomes 2. And that's it. You kind of see like, so then real GDP, you freeze the price in 2009. Now, interestingly, what's got to be true about 2009 real versus nominal? Like what's going to be true about GDP in 2009? It's going to be the same, right, as nominal, right? Like nominal and real are the same in the base year, which makes sense because you're using the same year. But it's going to change for 2010 because now we've frozen the prices and we've frozen the prices again. Prices are now always 10 and always 2. And the beauty of it, right, is now if real GDP increases, what do you know has to have happened? Yeah, you sold more. We made more pizzas and we made more lattes. And that's really what we care about for the economy overall. Okay, you guys get it? Makes sense? Yeah.
Isn't there like a calculation you can use to find the percentage for GDP? Like it's real GDP for like 1 year minus another year over something?
Yeah, if you want to do percentage increases, right, it's just a standard formula for percentages, which is, end value minus start value divided by start value. We'll have to calculate it later in the class, so you'll see it. But that's your standard formula for percentages. But I think in terms of calculating real GDP, the thing that matters is what we want to do is freeze the prices, and we freeze them. If the base year is 2009, then we just freeze them at the 2009 level. And now everybody is being valued at the same price. And so if real GDP increases, then we know that we made more stuff, and that's what we really care about. Okay, make sense? Now, to take it even further and kind of leads you to what we're going to talk about later, really what's the only purpose of prices? Prices are just like, it's an arbitrary measurement just to kind of measure value. But really, what are we using it to do? And it kind of shows you like what would happen if we were to change the base year. Real GDP would change a little bit because it would change something about pizzas and lattes. Can you guys see what it is? Like, what is it about pizzas and lattes?
The price reflects the supply and demand.
It does in that year. And it sort of represents the cost of making it plus the value to buyers of it. And essentially, if you look at it really carefully, what's true about one pizza versus a latte in 2009? It costs more, but how much more? Yeah, so like one pizza is the same as 5 lattes, right? And that's the only purpose of prices, right? It's just to make it so that things are comparable. Like I told you guys, like my analogy I said before is like, you know, an iPhone costs $1,000, a Tesla S costs like $80,000. So that means that what's true about one Tesla S? It's the same as 80 iPhones, right? One pizza is the same as 5 lattes. You change the base year though, now supply and demand conditions have changed for each of those goods. So say we did 2011, now what's true? One pizza is the same as 4 lattes. Do you guys see that? So what's happened is now lattes have become relatively more valuable in 1 year. But that's the only purpose of prices, is just to have a single way to kind of like judge the relative value of stuff. And that's kind of key to understanding why money really doesn't matter ultimately for the overall economy. But that's something we'll learn later in the class. So bottom line, in each year, right, nominal GDP, we're just using the current prices. Real GDP, we use constant prices. So therefore, the change in nominal GDP reflects changes in both prices and quantities. The change in real GDP is essentially how much GDP would change if prices didn't change at all. In other words, if there's zero inflation. And so that's why real GDP is corrected for inflation. Okay, everybody's good? Any questions at all there? So it's kind of cool to see actually, you know, nominal and real GDP over time. So this is what it actually looks like. So the blue line is nominal GDP. The red line is real GDP, so corrected for inflation. So what do you notice? What's generally true about nominal GDP? Year after year with only really one big exception. Huh? It's lower. Yeah, it's lower for most of the years, but what are the changes in it? It's typically always increasing, right? But it's increasing because typically year after year we make more stuff, but also what happens to prices? Prices become higher, right? Because we typically have positive inflation, not always, but most of the time we have positive inflation. So those higher prices plus the fact we're making more stuff makes nominal GDP almost always rise. But we don't care about prices because prices, we'll learn, is just an arbitrary distinction. It really doesn't really matter. What we care about is, are we making more stuff? And so the red line represents we take out the effects of inflation. And the nice thing is that over long periods of time, what's true? it increases, right? Which means America makes more stuff. And we make lots more stuff, which is actually pretty impressive, right? Because year after year, America grows by like 2 to 3% per year, which is pretty, you know, it doesn't sound like that much, but what's true, because the economy is so big, 2 to 3% of a really big number is still a really big number, right? Like we're growing by hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. But that's only true over long periods of time. When you look at it really closely though, there are periods where real GDP actually goes down. So we make less stuff in a year than we did last year. And what do you think we call those periods? These periods where we're making less stuff? These are typically recessions. Now you might be looking at it and be like, oh, you know, what's the big deal? Like, you know, it's just a tiny little blip. But like I said, when you have a gigantic economy, even a tiny little blip represents lots and lots of lost economic output. And so, for example, like this little blip here, which doesn't really look that much, represents millions of people becoming unemployed. Like millions of Americans during this really bad time for America. Check this out. So typically when you have a recession, especially like this is a great time for America, right? Because what happens after this recession? You get like huge growth, right? This is the 1990s, which was a great period for America. You know, under Clinton, there's like budget surpluses, the internet was coming on board, the economy was growing like crazy. There's a very small recession in 1990, but then after that, like 10 years of growth, nonstop growth. This, on the other hand, early 80s was a terrible time to be in the economy, because what happens here? You know, this happened to your grandparents. You get a recession, right? And then look at it, like you recover from it. And then what happens right after that? You have another recession. This is the famous, they call it the double dip recession, where 2 recessions occurred right after each other. And again, like you might look at it and be like, oh, okay, big deal. But this again represents millions and millions of people losing their jobs, you know, including possibly you in our future recession. So these are really big deals. You can see like what was the really bad thing that happened to us 10 years ago. The Great Recession, and you can see why it was a great recession, because look at the size of it compared to the previous recessions. You know, it was gigantic. Like this is a huge blip, you know, representing like I think 10 to 12 million more people becoming unemployed. So huge deal. Like these tiny little things actually matter huge amounts because it's real costs to actual human beings and people. Okay.